The market sets the damn game. It's like...
And the market is dominated by men.
No, it's not. It's not.
You...
The market is dominated by women. They make 80% of the consumer decisions.
Yes, 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 yes!
I mean, look at the conversation we're having right now. You know, like, you're certainly willing to risk offending me in the pursuit of truth. Why should you have the right to do that?
Yes!
It's been rather uncomfortable. Ha, gotcha.
Yes!
So I kind of played, let's say, knight on white horse. And that just floored me. Like, I was very distraught, I think is the right word about that this morning. Because the right way for this to end is not for me to declare victory, because I don't regard it as a victory.
No!
Because I can admit whatever mistakes I made.
Professor Peterson, your devastating performance during Cathy Newman's interview was an incredible win. It's exactly what we talk about here on Honey Badger Radio, using men's rights talking points.
No, it's not. It's not. The market is dominated by women.
And owning your vulnerability as a man.
Why should you have the right to do that? It's been rather uncomfortable.
In order to shut up women like Cathy Young.
Ha, gotcha.
Who want to dominate men's identities. And I don't think you're completely aware of just how big a win this was. So with all due respect, I'm going to attempt to explain to you how big a win it was and why you shouldn't walk it back into any kind of failure.
Like, I would like to ask her something, for example. I've been trying to puzzle this out. I saw a picture of her today that was a tweet. It was a tweet by one of her friends, and they said that the tweet was something like, "We're amusing ourselves watching the Twitter comments while waiting for the police investigation." Okay, and then there's a picture of Cathy holding a tablet, you know, looking shocked in a very pleased way, I think is the right way of. And you see, that's kind of what I'm worried about, is that she is shocked in a rather pleased way.
When I watched your interview with, I believe his name is Geen, I noticed that you seem to be backing away from regarding your interview with Cathy Newman as a flawless victory. For those of you who've been living under a rock, Professor Peterson went on Channel 4 to be interviewed by Cathy Newman, presumably about his book, 12 Rules, An Antidote to Chaos. But that didn't end up happening. Instead, Cathy Newman attempted to discredit and distort what Professor Peterson had to say for half an hour in a rather chanfreux display. Later on, Professor Peterson gave some other channels interviews analyzing what had occurred with Cathy Newman, with his interview with Cathy Newman. Professor Peterson, watching some of those post-interview interviews made me sympathize a great deal with what you were doing and what you were going through. I too tend to deconstruct my victories until they turn into failures. I too am baffled by the bad faith, aggressive behavior of people like Cathy Newman. And when I can't understand their behavior, I also tend to take too much responsibility and think I did something to cause it, because then it makes sense to me. And that's why I'm doing this video, because I don't want to see someone as obviously introspective, compassionate, and intelligent as yourself walk back something I see as a tremendous victory. As I go forward, I'm going to be critiquing what you did during your interview with Cathy Newman and afterwards during Channel 4's transparent attempt to discredit you and your fans. The reason why I'm offering this critique is not to offer pointers to you or as any sort of gotcha, but to set up why I think what you did was a fantastic win, and that you shouldn't beat yourself up over it any further, over minor tactical mistakes. I'm also going to be critiquing some of your tactical choices during the interview and afterwards, because you strike me as someone who will dismiss blanket praise out of hand. Finally, I'm using this critique to set up a framework for understanding Cathy Newman's actions. A framework that took me a long time to develop, and I did so in order to understand the behavior of people, mostly women, the behavior of people around me that I found completely baffling. I take a lot of solace from this framework that I've developed, and I give it to you in the hopes that you will as well when encountering people like Cathy Newman. The first part of the framework starts by recognizing that people operate in 3 dimensions of cognition in relation to the world around them. In fact, your interview took place in all 3 dimensions simultaneously. The first dimension is the rational dimension. I believe you and myself and many of the people we talk to and interact with occupy this one most of all. And the second is the emotional dimension. Now, most people operate in the emotional dimension most of the time. They use their emotions as a shortcut to determining the trustworthiness of new information. There's actually nothing wrong with operating in the emotional dimension. Our emotions represent shortcuts that allow us to quickly recognize patterns from the past and act on them. People who suffer from mental illnesses that remove their emotions are generally paralyzed with indecision. Sociopaths still have emotions. Without our emotions, we can't actually make choices about anything. In that sense, the emotional dimension overlaps fairly strongly with the rational one, since it functions as mostly of a shortcut. And then there's the threat narrative dimension, where you use language itself to dominate other people's identities. Cathy Newman appears to operate almost exclusively in this dimension. Now, some observations about the threat narrative dimension and how people act when they're in it. First of all, dominance is developed in reverse to that of the male dominance hierarchy in the threat narrative dimension. Male dominance, when you want to exert male dominance, you inflate your potential threat to induce feelings of vulnerability in your target so they don't want to fight back or they submit to you. Threat narrative dominance is established by exactly the reverse. If I were to create a threat narrative targeted at you, Professor Peterson, I would inflate the perception of my own vulnerability while exaggerating the danger you pose to me. This also applies to groups. For example, I can emphasize women's vulnerability to the things that you say by calling your writings misogynist abuse. A threat narrative has an overall anatomy. It's composed of 2 basic parts: the centered vulnerable group or person and the target. The group or person who's having their potential threat to the vulnerable center inflated or even lied about. The goal of a threat narrative is to control the target's identity. You either get them labeled by others as a harmful or potentially harmful element, or you get them to label themselves as such, eliciting a defensive reaction to your threat narrative. Unfortunately, defensive reactions make us look dishonest and are often confusing to people watching us, as they are in the aforementioned emotional dimension. The purpose of a threat narrative is thus to dominate another person's identity and sense of self by forcing them to prove to you that they aren't a threat. In order to force this, you have to in turn be either seen to embody or advocate for the vulnerable center that they supposedly threaten. Most importantly, people in the threat narrative dimension can use threat narratives to short-circuit communication in the emotional dimension, in the dimension we spend most of our time in sussing out the world around us. They can spin out enough uncertainty, make people whose identities they dominate look confused and defensive, and silence their target because they can't create the emotional rapport with others in order to even be heard. Unfortunately, when we're defensive, we do not look trustworthy. We look dangerous, and that's the point. That's what Cathy Newman is trying to do. Cathy Newman's overall central threat narrative is that women are vulnerable to threatening, dangerous, and oppressive men. This threat narrative, the feminist threat narrative, is all about toxic masculinity, patriarchy, and rape culture. And it is the central threat narrative of our society, not because it's true, but because it's effective. It's effective for a lot of reasons, but the primary reasons are: men strive to be of use to women in society. It's right in the name man, which a man earns, being a real man, by being useful. Because men's positive identity is derived from being of use to women, you can induce an almost instantaneous defensive response in a man by accusing him of being harmful to women. And it's this defensive response that is, again, so useful to dominate and silence men. Now, in specific, in what Cathy Newman was doing in the interview, Cathy Newman operated in the threat narrative dimension, and from the perspective of her threat narrative, you actually came into her domain swinging. You've written a book that, at least in part, frames young men as vulnerable to her feminist threat narrative that paints them as oppressors. And then you did this.
I don't think that young men hear words of encouragement. Some of them never in their entire lives, as far as I can tell. That's what they tell me. And the fact that the words that I've been speaking, the YouTube lectures that I've done and put online, for example, have had such a dramatic impact is an indication that young men are starving for this sort of message, because, like, why in the world would they have to derive it from a lecture on YouTube?
And she responded like this.
They're not being taught that they...
Rapid blinking is a stress response. Right there, you challenged her dominance. You challenged her dominance over your identity and men's identity. And then you had the audacity to emphasize women's enjoyment of dominating men. You emphasized young men's vulnerabilities. And you emphasized women, just some women, but women's potential to do harm. Some women is enough. Even the possibility that women can do harm is enough for women like Cathy Newman. Both of these things directly challenge Cathy Newman's threat narrative framework. She wants to center women's vulnerability and exaggerate men's harm, and you have just done the reverse. To translate it into men's dominance language, this is what you did to Cathy Newman.
He's a great shot, folks, but he can also miss. Come on now, this could be your lucky chance.
She may not have even gone into this interview expecting to get as aggressive as she got. But once you laid down the gauntlet, the claws came out. Everything she did was to paint you and your audience as harmful or potentially harmful to women, to make you conform to her threat narrative and reassert her dominance over your identity.
But does it bother you that your audience is predominantly male? Isn't that a bit divisive? What's in it for the women, though? So you're saying women have some sort of duty to sort of help fix the crisis of masculinity. What gives you the right to say that? Well, you say there are whole disciplines in universities forthrightly hostile towards men. These are the areas of study dominated by the postmodern stroke neo-Marxist claim that Western culture in particular is an oppressive structure created by white men to dominate and exclude women. It seems to a lot of women that they're still being dominated and excluded, to quote your words back to you.
And to a degree, she succeeded. In the first half of the interview, she does manage to get you to appear to contradict yourself. She does get you defensive, and she gets you to argue in her framework, to defend her accusations that you don't benefit women, which, think about it, not everything in the world has to benefit women. And something that doesn't benefit women isn't necessarily evil, but unfortunately, she got you arguing that. For anyone who already trusts you on an emotional level or who exists in the dimension of reason, Cathy's behavior is reprehensible. She's arguing in bad faith. She's putting words in your mouth. But for people who haven't established a rapport of trust with you and feel things out emotionally, which is most people, she's successfully kicked up enough emotional noise to make it impossible for them to establish a rapport with you and start to receive your information.
Oh.
Hell, it's hard to even hear what you had to say because half the interview's over and you haven't even been able to spend more than a minute talking about your book and how you hope to encourage young men towards adulthood. She's successfully turned what should be an opportunity for you to explain your insight into a knockdown, drag-out fight for dominance. Further, Cathy dominated the debate frame in the beginning of the interview, and what I mean by that is she successfully framed the debate in terms of women's vulnerabilities. When Cathy centers the argument on women's vulnerability, in this case, the wage gap, she doesn't have to prove it. She just has to create enough uncertainty that people err on the side of caution. The side of caution here is believing that women are victims of the wage gap. So this is how Cathy Newman managed to take what should have been an exchange of ideas and turn it into a knock-down, drag-out fight over dominance, over threat narrative dominance, over her threat narrative dominance.
Those upside-down pistols of yours really worry me. Fellas that carry them like that are bad medicine.
A knockdown, drag-out fight that she almost won. Then 18 minutes and 39 seconds in, everything changed. And when I say everything, I mean everything. I'll do one more. Do you enjoy Honey Badger Radio content? Do you want to see us make more of it? Then become a patron at www.patreon.com/honeybadgerradio. And if you need an alternative option, you can try www.feedthebadger.com/honeybadgerradio. No, that's not right. That's not shit. Feedthebadger.com. No Honey Badger Radio, because that is our website, so it doesn't need to specify. Anyway, www.patreon.com/honeybadgerradio or www.feedthebadger.com. Become a patron and enjoy extra content like bonus videos and special patron-only previews. Our patrons are currently enjoying the second half of this response to Cathy Newman's interview of Jordan Peterson. And if you'd like to see it right now, become a patron, www.patreon.com/honeybadgerradio. And be sure to join us in the Discord so you can talk to me and we can do fun things together. I'm not actually, like, I'm trying to be earnest, and I really mean can hang out with us on the Discord and we can do fun things together. Shit, I'm gonna go now.